You said you were done. You meant it. Every part of you meant it. You blocked the number, deleted the messages, told yourself this was the last time. And then, 3 days later, maybe a week, something shifted. A song. A silence that lasted too long. A thought that arrived uninvited and wouldn't leave. And before you fully understood what was happening, you were reaching for the door you swore you'd closed. This isn't weakness. It isn't love. It's something your brain is doing to you, and it has a name, and a mechanism, and a reason you were never told about. Psychologists call it intermittent reinforcement. The principle is disturbing in its simplicity. A reward that arrives randomly, unpredictably, is more addictive than one that arrives every time. The animal that gets fed on a fixed schedule stops pressing the lever when the food stops coming. But the one that never knew when the food was coming, it never stops. It presses harder. That is the mechanism behind every slot machine in every casino on the planet. And it is the exact same mechanism your nervous system has been running on. The person who hurt you was never consistently cruel. They were warm, then cold, present, then gone, apologetic, then devastating. And your brain read that pattern the only way it knows how. Keep trying. The reward is coming. It always comes eventually. There's a second mechanism, quieter, but just as relentless. Ari Kruglansky, a cognitive psychologist, called it the need for cognitive closure. When something ends without an explanation that makes sense, the brain doesn't accept the ending. It runs loops, replays conversations, reconstructs moments, builds the version of events where the equation finally balances. You don't loop because you want them back. You loop because the equation didn't close. And here's what nobody tells you. It was never going to close. Not because you weren't paying attention, because the other person never processed it at the same depth. They moved on. Your brain is still in the room, staring at a problem that has no solution they were ever equipped to give you. And then there's this. Every fight you had, every argument, every attempt to be understood, every defense was emotional investment. Patrick Carnes documented what he called the trauma bond, the wiring that forms when a nervous system alternates between pain and relief, between threat and warmth. The attachment that builds in that space is deeper than anything formed on consistency alone, which means every time you argued, every time you tried to explain, you weren't weakening the connection, you were reinforcing it. Every fight was still a bond. Every explanation was still contact. Every defense was still connection. The only thing that doesn't feed the cycle is consistent silence. And silence is the hardest thing for a system like this to choose. But here's where it gets complicated. When you finally stop responding, the other person intensifies. The thinking about you, the sudden need to reconnect, to explain, to get closure. It looks like regret. Psychologists call it an extinction burst, one final escalation before a behavior dies, triggered when the expected response stops arriving. It doesn't feel like a final surge. It feels like the moment you've been waiting for. It isn't. It's a test of access. The slot machine checking whether the lever still works. If you respond, even angrily, even to say you're done, the loop restarts from zero. If what you've heard so far already feels uncomfortably familiar, subscribe to Quiet Psychology. What comes next goes into the parts of this that nobody is willing to talk about. Here's what's harder to hear. The biggest problem isn't what they did, it's what happens inside you after. The urgency to respond, the need to defend yourself to someone who isn't even listening anymore. Every reaction, every explanation, every confrontation, every proof you feel compelled to offer carries the same message. You still have access to my nervous system. The door is open. You don't need them in the room to keep the system running. You maintain it yourself. Because the person may have left, but the voice stayed. You hear it in your own thoughts now. the version of them that lives in your head, the one that never needed a phone number to reach you. You rehearse arguments that will never happen. You construct entire conversations with someone who isn't there, defending yourself to no one, preparing a case for a court that dissolved years ago. Susan Nolan Huxmer called this rumination, the mind returning to the same wound, not to heal it, but because returning is the most automatic thing it knows. The groove is cut deep, and thought follows the easiest path. And then there's what feels like power, the fantasy of becoming someone they'll regret losing, the imagined moment they finally understand what they had. That's not freedom, that's the last disguise of the connection. Wanting them to suffer is still proof they have access to your emotional system. The desire for revenge doesn't look like attachment. It feels like reclaiming something, like strength. But underneath it lives the same hunger to matter to them, to close the equation on your terms. Even your anger is still a form of return. And if you've ever made it past the anger, you know what's waiting on the other side. When you finally stop, when the silence fills the room, your mind doesn't rest. It goes back, not to the person, to the pain. Because an empty mind doesn't sit with emptiness. It searches for the most familiar signal it can find. And the most familiar signal is the one that hurt the most. This is not weakness. It's abstinence. A brain trained on chaos reads silence as danger. A nervous system, calibrated to intensity, interprets stillness as something missing, and so the mind does the only thing it knows. It opens the door. But here's what the door is actually keeping you from. Not them. The voice that was there before them. The one they only made louder. Do you keep going back because you want them back, or because you're afraid of what you'll hear in the silence they left behind? Closure is not coming from them, not because they're necessarily cruel, but because the closure you're looking for was never in their explanation. It's in the moment you stop needing one. The equation you're trying to solve doesn't have a solution that arrives from outside. Your brain has been waiting on a variable that was never going to be delivered. There are two kinds of silence after a connection like this. There's the silence of anger, where you stop responding because you want them to notice, because you're waiting to see if they'll come back, because the silence is still a message. That silence feeds the cycle. The door is still open, you're just standing behind it. And then there's decided silence. Silence with no intended audience. The kind where you stop responding not to prove something, but because you finally understood what responding was costing you. That silence doesn't need acknowledgement. It doesn't need them to do anything. It simply removes you from the game, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. The day will come, and you may not believe this yet, when the message arrives and you feel nothing. Not triumph, not rage, not sadness, nothing. That's not numbness. That's the sound of a loop that finally ended. If someone you care about keeps going back to what hurts them, don't tell them to be stronger. They already know. What they need is someone willing to sit with them in the silence they're terrified of, without trying to fill it. And if you are them, the next time you reach for the door, pause. Just long enough to ask, am I reaching for them, or am I running from the silence? If the answer is the silence, the door isn't the problem. The work is in the room you're standing in. There's a door you've been building your life around. Maybe you didn't build it. Maybe it was built around you, and you organized everything around it. Your routines, your emotional patterns, your definition of what love is supposed to feel like. All of it structured around a door that was never supposed to be the center of a life. You've closed it before, dozens of times, but never locked it, because locking it means accepting that no one is coming through. And that has always felt more terrifying than leaving it open. But what happens when you close it, really close it, is this. You stop living in the hallway. The rooms that have been waiting for you, the ones you've passed through on your way back to the door, they're still there. Empty, yes. Unfamiliar. Strange the way peace feels strange when chaos is all you've ever known. Empty rooms aren't a problem. They're a foundation. You were never supposed to build your life around whether someone was coming or going. You were never supposed to be a waiting room. You were supposed to be a home.